I'm Courtney. We're a family of 5 trying to grow as much of our own food as we can, and we raise chickens. Our kids wanted to name our little backyard farm, so we did. It's called Heart Pine Farms. In this video, I'll take you with me as I prune each variety of determinate, indeterminate, and semi-determinate tomato plants in our garden. Like most other methods of gardening, there are many methods of tomato plant pruning. The methods I'll show you are the ones I've found over the years to work in our garden for the varieties we're growing in our specific climate. These are our tomato plants right now on July 25th. We transplanted the seedlings into the garden on June 5th this year. Normally I prune them a couple of weeks after transplanting, but I didn't make it out to prune until a month later in the beginning of July. This video will show you how rapidly tomato plants take off after they've been transplanted. It's the beginning of July and I'm out here getting ready to prune our tomato plants, and we have determinate tomato plants, we have indeterminate tomato plants, and we have semi-determinate tomato plants, and I wanted to show you how I approach pruning each one of those. We've got Skyway, we've got Roma, we have San Marzano, and we have cherry bomb tomatoes, and I'll show you how we prune those. So I usually like to prune them a couple of weeks after I transplant them out in the garden, but I'm running late because number one, I planted the plants late, which means that it has gotten really hot. It's been in the lower 90s with high dew points and high humidity. It's been hard for me to get out and work because I was sick for a week too, so I'm just delayed. Regardless, the plants are looking pretty good. We've had some torrential rains, but they're still looking pretty good. Disease free, they just need a little bit of maintenance. These are our Skyway tomato plants. They are somewhere in between determinate and indeterminate plants. So they produce more like indeterminate plants, but they grow a little bit more like determinate plants. They're a little bit bushier, but they'll get a little bit taller than actual determinate plants. They just won't sprawl out as much as the indeterminate plants do. You can see here, obviously, I'm gonna need to pull some weeds in this bed. It's mulched really well, so the weeds are pretty easy to pull, and we don't have a ton of weeds out here, so they're pretty easy to take care of, but I have neglected these beds, like I said, since I've transplanted these. I've pretty much made sure that they've been watered, and I still need to install the irrigation, which I'll do a separate video on that. But yeah, Bermuda grass is just always out of control. It likes to come up on the edges, but not too bad. I just like to keep the weeds away from the plants as much as possible to keep the disease risk down. Okay, so if you look very closely at this plant, you can see that there are some branches that are touching the ground. So I'm going to take clean shears and trim that right off. You can also see that, let's see, any of the branches that have diseased leaves, this is on the plant that's on the other side of this panel here, but you can see, if you look closely, you can see that the leaves have some yellow spots on them. I'm going to remove that whole entire branch. So after I'm finished pruning a group of tomatoes, or a bed of tomatoes in this case, these 4 Skyway tomatoes, I clean my shears with rubbing alcohol, just to make sure I don't spread disease to another one of the beds. This is all I do right here, just with alcohol. This is the only way that I've found that really disinfects them on the spot, and then you can continue using them right away. Otherwise, you can take a bucket like this and do bleach and water, but in that case, you'd have to soak the shears for about 30 minutes in between uses. So alcohol is really the quickest and easiest way that I find. Okay, so let's look at this Skyway plant really closely. So when I planted it right up against this panel. And I put a stake in here to try to help the plant kind of stand up. But actually what I am going to do is I'm going to take one of my soft ties here. I really like this soft tie here because it stretches. And I used to use like plastic twisty ties, but those kind of dig into the stems, and then when they get bigger, they cut into them and they can't really grow freely. But since these are stretchy, it really doesn't do any damage to the stem. So here's the plant. I'm just going to gently support it by tying it right here, and then I'm just going to kind of train it back up again. Because since I didn't make it out here, I'm just going to pull another couple of weeds here. They really took off 2 weeks after I transplanted them, and since I didn't make it out here to kind of train them, they're starting to flop over a little bit. So I'm just going to give them a little bit extra support. But you can see right here that These branches are being supported by the cage just fine. If I go down here, you can see that this one's a little bit close for comfort, so I'm gonna prune this one right off. Okay, and then here's another one right here that you can see that is touching the ground, so I'm gonna prune that one right off. Okay, so the rest of them are looking pretty good. And probably, let's see, probably take this one off right here. And this one. All right, it's looking pretty good. The next thing I'm going to look for is air circulation. As far as removing suckers, the only time I really remove suckers is if I see the plant getting too bushy to prevent air circulation. Where we are, it's really hot and humid, and it's really important for good air circulation to help avoid disease. The plant is just more productive that way. So this plant looks pretty good to me. Yeah, I think it looks pretty good. So I'm not going to prune anything. Some people like to remove all of the suckers because they feel that, you know, the plant then can focus on fruit production. The suckers they actually do produce fruit. So if you are going to remove suckers from a determinate plant, I would remove them below the first blossom, because determinate plants, when they produce fruit, this is a semi-determinate plant, so it acts more like an indeterminate plant. But if this were a determinate plant, like I'll show you when we get down to the Romas, you're not going to want to prune anything above the first set of blossoms or tomatoes. So in this case, it would be right here. Because determinate plants, that's all the fruit that they're gonna set for the whole entire season. I personally don't have a lot of time to spend pruning because we have 32 plants and I'm just really busy with kids and the big garden and so many other things that I don't have time to obsessively prune each and every one of my tomato plants. And the varieties that we grow, they're hybrids. You know, they grow really well. They're pretty hardy and they grow really well in our area. So I don't really feel the need to be spending tons of time, you know, pruning exactly this many suckers or trying to remove all of the suckers. Or I just go by when I'm out in the garden weeding or watering, and I just kind of glance at the plants. Is there anything touching the ground? Does anything look diseased? Or does the plant look like it's getting out of control? Do I need to remove a few suckers to improve airflow? And that's about it. And over the past 10 years that we've been growing tomato plants here, that approach has worked well in our garden. Now that this one Skyway tomato plant is looking good, I'm just gonna move on to the next one. If you mulch really well, it's not gonna 100% take care of the weeds, but it does a pretty good job. And then they are easier to pull out. But like I said, yeah, the Bermuda grass is always just a battle. So yesterday we went inside to take a quick break, and then a storm rolled in and dumped a bunch of rain, probably like half an inch of rain. So we stopped pruning because the plants were wet. I just don't like pruning when the plants are wet just because of the risk of disease. So we're out here again today, and it's quite hot and muggy, but the plants have had about 24 hours to dry off. So I'm gonna start pruning again. This is a bed of Roma tomato plants, and if you remember, in my previous video, The Roma seedlings that I was transplanting into the garden looked really, really sad. They only had a few little branches on the top and they just looked so sad. But you can see how, when in doubt, don't throw them away, because they will take off when you get them out in the garden. These plants have made a huge leap right here. So our Roma plants right here, these are determinate plants. That means that the flowers grow at the tips of the stems right here like this, and then the foliage pretty much slows down. So the plants don't get huge. They're like kind of compact and bushy like this. The fruit that grows, they pretty much blossom kind of at the same time, and that means that they'll ripen all at the same time. So your harvest is pretty much all at once, and that's why Romas are so good for canning and making sauce, because it's just easy to organize canning that way. When they're all ready at one time, then it's predictable. Since these plants are nice and bushy and compact already, I really don't need to tie them up to the middle panel like this, because they're pretty much nicely supported already by the panel and the cage. They're filling out nicely in the cage, and I just have one stake right here. The plant's not even tied to the stake, it's just leaning up against it. I don't prune suckers off of determinate plants because suckers do still produce fruit. And I might, if I see them getting too bushy and I'm concerned about airflow, then I might remove some of them, but no more than like a quarter of them or a half of them. I basically focus my pruning attention on the bottom of the plant to make sure that none of the leaves are touching the ground, and I remove any possibly diseased looking branches. So I just finished pruning a Roma bed and I'm moving on to a San Marzano. I'm sterilizing my shears. These are the San Marzano tomatoes, which are indeterminate, and that means that the blossoms form on the sides of the stems. The foliage doesn't really slow down as far as growth goes. It keeps growing throughout the whole entire growing season. I've found with indeterminate tomatoes is that we have smaller harvests, but they continue throughout the whole entire growing season, where the determinate pretty much ripen all at once, and then that's all you're going to get. These will keep growing until the first frost. They also have a vinier growth habit, which means they will go completely nuts, even if they are caged. Pruning is more necessary with these indeterminate plants than the determinate plants, since they keep going. These have not been pruned since I transplanted them in the garden, and you can see how much they have started to completely take off. They're turning into a jungle. I'm going to go down and of course try to prop them up as much as I can on this middle panel here and the cages, and that works just fine. But my primary goal is to get all of the foliage pruned that is touching the ground down there to try to prevent disease, because it would be nice if these plants will go until the first frost. So as far as suckers go, I kind of lose track because I start focusing on harvests and I get really busy out here, so I'm not out here obsessively trying to remove all the suckers that I see. But I do like to try to improve airflow, so I might come out here and remove some if I think that the plant needs some more air circulation. I would say over the course of the growing season, maybe I end up removing like half of the suckers from these plants. Okay, so this first plant that I'm going to start to work on here, I don't think I'm going to have to tie it up to the panel here because it's pretty well supported by the cage and this middle panel already, but I wanted to zoom in here so that you could see how the suckers kind of start to grow. Here's one right here. So they grow between the main stem and then the side stem like this. They grow about right here. And they are pretty vigorous. You can see here's another one right here growing. But San Marzanos have grown pretty well in our growing zone, and they've remained pretty disease-free. We've lucked out with the weather, I guess. They started out really cool. There were temperatures in the 60s a couple of weeks after I planted these, and just solid rain all week long, so I was kind of worried about them, but we've lucked out and none of them have gotten diseases so far, and now here we are in the upper 80s, around 90, and they seem to be setting fruit just fine. We're getting lucky this year after planting so late too. So yeah, if you were gonna go through and remove suckers, you'd just go through and just trim them off. And if you let them get big enough, like if you can see this sucker right here is pretty good size, you can actually stick these in a pot of soil and you can start a new plant. But I do not have the time to do that this year or the space, and so these are just going to go into the burn pile. But yeah, you can make a lot of new plants from suckers if you wanted to. These are our cherry bomb tomato plants. We've got 3 of them in one 4x8 bed. These are indeterminate plants. These plants keep going and going. These are super vining plants. These are the little cherry tomatoes that we're gonna have in pasta salads and whatnot and eating fresh. I have them caged very well, so you can see how they're kind of being supported by this cage and this panel in the middle. These, just like the San Marzanos, I'm just gonna keep an eye on them, and when they need to be trimmed so that they can have more airflow, I will prune them and try to keep everything up off of the ground. This one, you can see, this one needs to be pruned off because it's touching the ground, and there's also a sucker growing in there too, so I'll just remove that while I'm at it. These plants are very, very prolific, the cherry tomato plants. I'm just gonna get down here and trim some more, just to keep everything up off of the ground, even though it is very hot. I'm not gonna prune all of these plants. I'm just gonna prune one just to show you because it's so hot, and we can only be out here for a short amount of time just because of the humidity. It's kind of oppressive out here. So yeah, this is why we've just had these pop-up storms every day, because the humidity. And dew point's about 80 degrees. You know that it's probably gonna rain soon. So I don't see any diseased leaves on here, so I'm just, of course I have to remove the weeds too, but I'm just kind of cleaning up this plant here. Probably take this one off too because it's touching the ground. These I will prune a little bit heavier than the determinate plants that we have growing. You can see how the plant starts to grow through the other side of the cage here too. I will come in here and there's some that are touching the ground, or getting close to touching the ground, so I'll trim them back on the other side too here. Like this one, I'm just gonna take off to lighten up the plant a little bit. This one, here's a sucker. Take that off. And then I think I'm gonna get my tie here. These I will tie up periodically, just to give them a little bit more support as they're growing, because since they go absolutely crazy. You can see a sucker growing right here too. I'm not going to remove that because I don't feel like I have to really increase airflow at the moment right now. There, looks pretty clean to me. Here's a view of our Skyway tomatoes right now on July 25th. I made a short 1-minute video on how I set up the drip irrigation in this bed, which you can find in the shorts library on our channel if you'd like to check it out. There are lots of tomatoes growing on the Skyway plants, which will hopefully be ripening in the next couple of weeks. Here's one bed of the Roma plant, same thing, plenty of tomatoes growing but not quite as far along as the Skyway. And here's the cherry bomb bed where we actually have the first tomatoes that are starting to ripen. You can see how different the growth habits are for these indeterminate plants versus the determinate Romas. Same with the indeterminate San Marzano plants here, they're really starting to turn into a jungle. Plenty of tomatoes growing. And lastly, sadly, we had a disease issue in one of the Roma beds that very quickly took all 4 plants. I'm going to make a detailed video showing you how to deal with tomato plant disease issues, so please stay tuned if you'd like. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe if our videos are helpful to you.